welcome to our witnesses and to our committee members. This is meeting number 25 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 12th, the committee is going to start its study on recent developments in Canada's trade relations with China and with Qatar. Before we get into hearing from our witnesses, I want to turn the floor over to Ms. Ursuvar Tremblay for a moment.
I didn't ask to speak specifically, Madam Chair. He didn't ask to speak specifically, Madam Chair.
I want to acknowledge and say it was unfortunate to see the incident that you were attacked in Brussels. If you want to give a bit of information to the committee to that experience.
Écoutez, j'ai raconté
I specifically discussed the steps and what happened in terms of the events. Everything went okay. I wasn't injured. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues and you as well. And on my other committee, the chair also was very helpful. I'd like to thank all of the colleagues who supported me in this and who sent me very sincere and kind words. I think it was shocking and troubled many people to know that this type of events can happen. And once again, I'm a large man of 6 foot 2 feet, and I can't imagine if it had happened to a woman or someone who is not the same size. So you always have to be very careful in such cases. And also in terms of members, this is an example. Of course, we did report this to the Sergeant at Arms. Well, this kind of thing can happen when members are traveling.
Very much for sharing that information with us, and we're very glad to see you're back here in Canada, where it's we hope safer, but I don't know about that some days. But we're glad you're back and you're safe and everything is all right. All right, continuing on, then we have with us today from the Canada-China Business Council, Bijan Ahmadi, the Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer by video conference, and from Strategic Effects, Michael Kovrig, Executive Director, someone who's well known, respected by all of us, not just here in Parliament, but throughout Canada. And so we're very happy to have you here with us, Mr. Kovrig. We will open the floor with Mr. Ahmadi for remarks for up to 5 minutes, please.
Madam Chair, thank you for the invitation to appear before the committee today. Since 1978, the Canada-China Business Council, CCBC, has served as the leading voice of the Canadian business community on China, working to advance practical solutions that support responsible commercial engagement and advance Canada's national economic interests. We represent more than 300 member companies from different sectors across Canada. Our membership includes both major Canadian corporations and small and medium-sized enterprises that are actively engaged in trade and investment with China. China is Canada's second largest trading partner, with bilateral merchandise and services trade of around $130 billion. The economic impact of the relationship is substantial. Trade and investment with China support over 400,000 Canadian jobs nationwide. China is also a major source of foreign direct investment into Canada. FDI stock in Canada from China and Hong Kong reached approximately $65 billion in 2024. Investment and trade ties with China support economic activity in many different sectors across Canada, including oil and gas, mining, finance, forestry, agri-food, consumer products, manufacturing, and tourism, among other sectors. Education ties are equally important and contribute significantly in terms of economic value and people-to-people ties. In recent months, and particularly since Prime Minister Carney's visit to China in January, we have seen constructive progress in the bilateral economic relationship. High-level engagements that began around the summer of last year by the federal government have led to tangible and positive outcomes. During the Prime Minister's recent visit to China, the two governments agreed to a package of solutions to address some of the irritants and tariff escalations that severely impacted bilateral trade, and in particular, our agri-food workers and producers across the country. Through these agreements, starting March 1st, China will lower tariffs on Canadian canola seed to a combined rate of approximately 15% from a current rate of 84%. China will also remove its 25% anti-discrimination tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, peas, and crabs. In addition, China has dropped its ban on Canadian beef and is expected to accelerate restoring access to Canadian pet food. The Canadian government also agreed to a limited quota system that will allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles to enter the Canadian market, with a focus on bringing affordable EVs to Canada and opening up opportunities for joint investment by Chinese automakers in the Canadian EV supply chain. The new Canada-China Economic and Trade Cooperation Roadmap signed during the Prime Minister's visit and the reconvening of dialogue mechanisms such as the Economic and Financial Strategic Dialogue, Financial Working Group, Ministerial Dialogue on Energy, and Joint Agriculture Committee provide important mechanisms for ongoing engagement to address current challenges and explore opportunities to further expand mutually beneficial economic cooperation. The Canadian business community has responded positively to Ottawa's efforts toward the recalibration of bilateral ties. In CCBC's latest business survey conducted by the Rotman Institute for International Business at the University of Toronto, 82% of surveyed Canadian firms indicated that the government's renewed approach to China would have a positive impact on their business outlook. And a third of the surveyed firms reported that they are preparing to expand their business with China. Looking ahead, I would offer 4 brief recommendations. First, the reestablished bilateral mechanisms should be used actively to address trade barriers and improve market access for Canadian businesses. To provide 2 examples, access for pet food and tariffs on Canadian pork are still challenges that we need to work on. Second, provide clarity and predictability in investment policy. There are opportunities to responsibly attract capital into both conventional renewable energy projects as well as manufacturing and agri-food. Clarity on sectors open to investment, national security guardrails, and an efficient review process are essential. Third, support Canadian business development efforts in China. China is one of the most competitive markets in the world. Canadian companies succeed there because of quality, reliability, and brand strength. Further investment towards enhanced export promotion, trade missions, and sector-specific support can help more Canadian firms compete effectively. Fourth, facilitate travel, education, and business exchanges. Canadian companies frequently raise concerns about visa processing timelines for their Chinese partners, customers, or prospective clients traveling to Canada. If we want to fully capitalize on renewed momentum in bilateral engagement, Canada will need to look at improving the efficiency of our visa processes. In closing, the Canada-China economic relationship is complex, but it's also consequential. A pragmatic, disciplined, and well-structured engagement strategy is not about ignoring differences. It is about advancing Canadian prosperity and national interest in a changing global environment. At a time when Canada is seeking to diversify its trade and double its non-U.S. exports within the next decade, China's scale and growth trajectory remain highly relevant. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maddy. On to Mr. Colford, please, for up to 5 minutes. You have to unmute yourself, Mr. Colford. Okay, thank you.
My apologies. Thank you very much, ma'am. It's an honor to speak to the committee. In January, Prime Minister Mark Carney visited China and restored leader-level political relations and diplomatic dialogue mechanisms. If that were all his trip achieved, I would have considered it entirely successful. However, the visit went beyond that by reviving strategic partnership language and making agreements to reduce trade barriers and explore further trade and investment opportunities. As a short-term tactic, this was an expedient way to buy economic breathing room while Canada adjusts to a more challenging geopolitical environment. The important question now is what the government does next. Over time, normalizing relations without accountability and seeking relief from renewed coercion through bilateral deals risks confirming to the Chinese Communist Party that democracies will yield to pressure and accommodate power. If such acquiescence continues, Canada risks setting an example that weakens the very alliances and coalitions that Mr. Carney himself called for in his speech to Davos. And it risks his efforts to modernize and strengthen those very coalitions. It's crucial to recognize that the CCP's objectives include dividing and weakening the West and making China the preeminent global power. General Secretary Xi Jinping himself has articulated a geoeconomic strategy to seize the commanding heights of advanced technology and manufacturing and increase other countries' dependence on China while minimizing China's reliance on others. That is not a free trade agenda. It's aggressive mercantilism that's ultimately harmful to Canada's interests. Consequently, the narrow monetary benefits from increasing economic relations with China must be weighed against the asymmetric costs of protecting Canadian society and democracy from foreign influence and interference, and the risks of helping the CCP achieve long-term goals that threaten Canadian and allied sovereignty, prosperity, and national security. I think Canadians will find that once the full costs are calculated, far fewer trade and investment agreements with China would pass a net benefit test. Let me provide some specific examples of why turning to China to hedge against America First policies is ultimately risky. Trading with China without structural discipline risks relegating Canada to a second-class role as a supplier of commodities that depends on Beijing for the critical technologies of the 21st century. So on trade, first, opportunities to sell more commodities are limited. China is running enormous trade surpluses and investing heavily in self-sufficiency in energy, food, and advanced technologies. Its imports are stagnant and its growth is slowing. Second, in exchange for market access, the party state will demand more political and economic concessions. Third, replacing lost manufacturing exports to the US with commodity exports to China while importing more Chinese manufacturers makes Canada more vulnerable to external shocks, not less. The trajectory is neither true diversification nor resilience, but rather the erosion of Canada's remaining industrial depth. Fourth, increasing agri-food sales beyond past peaks would deepen dependence and increase Beijing's leverage. They are highly concentrated trade agreements in politically influential sectors and risk ceding more leverage to Beijing unless offset by increased exports to more reliable partners. On investment, first, as for attracting direct investment, even if Ottawa can incentivize Chinese manufacturers of electric vehicles and other technologies to produce in Canada, it's likely to be using highly automated final assembly plants with limited employment opportunities. While U.S. investment typically comes with market access, that's rarely going to be the case with Chinese firms. They're also hoping to access the U.S. market, and so we should expect them to move slowly while awaiting greater clarity on American policies. Second, the CCP will likely restrict Chinese companies from transferring sensitive technology and process knowledge, and other aspects of China's industrial model, such as low wages, clustering at scale, and massive state support and incentives, can't be duplicated in Canada. So adopting Chinese technology would also embed these sectors in Chinese supply chains, technical standards, ideology, and political economy pathologies that the CCP is already wielding for geopolitical influence. Third, the hope that this will stimulate domestic firms to innovate and increase productivity is misplaced. Instead, Canadian firms and their suppliers would compete against much larger companies backed by a one-party state that enables them to absorb huge losses, survive for years without profits, and subsidize capturing market share until competitors are forced to exit. It could leave Canada further deindustrialized and dependent on exports. So ultimately, China can offer some tactical sector-specific opportunities, but they should be caveated by Canada's structural trade deficit with China, Beijing's record of weaponizing interdependence, and the strategic risk of deepening concentrated reliance on aggressive big powers rather than true diversification with trusted partners. In concluding, I would advise this Parliament and all Canadians to scrutinize the implementation and repercussions of these and any other new agreements with China, and I would advise the government to move cautiously and transparently. Otherwise, Canada risks falling further into a trap of asymmetric dependence in which the CCP offers inducements, builds Canadian constituencies, expects political deference in return, and readily resorts to coercion to ensure compliance. That's not a deal that Canada should take. Ephemeral stability purchased through accommodation today invites more coercion tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciated your comments. We will now open the floor for questions. On to Mr. Chambers for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Kovrig, it's my honor today to welcome you to the committee. I know that the chair welcomed you, but thank you for your appearing. Wanted to let you know that I was elected in 2021, and one of the first issues that constituents brought to me was your case during your detention and wanting to make sure that it was publicized and that people knew what you were going through. So I just wanted to say thank you and appreciate your sobering comments and your perspective that you'll share with us here today. You mentioned about and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll maybe just ask you to comment. Do you believe that the CCP has a global agenda?
Yes, so I've studied the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese politics and foreign policy for a couple of decades, including, of course, working as a diplomat and then with the International Crisis Group. And there is no question that they have long-term strategies, some of which are published. And it doesn't require access to classified government information to reach fairly clear conclusions. Just to simplify, I would say they have at least three broad objectives. First of all, to make China the dominant power in East Asia, to really achieve, first of all, preeminence there and in the Western Pacific. Secondly, secondly, to eventually become the preeminent power in the international system and acquire the power to reshape the international order and ideally purge it of liberal international norms and rules and make it more amenable to an authoritarian one-party state and its own interests. That is really an agenda that it is then serving through a mercantilist economic strategy. So the concern, particularly for this committee, I think, is what are China's objectives vis-a-vis the Canadian economy and Western economies, and what are the geopolitical implications of those? Ultimately, China wants to dominate global manufacturing and high technology and relegate other countries, particularly Canada and Australia, for example, or Argentina and Brazil, to supplying it with the raw materials that it needs for its industrial might. The party sees manufacturing capacity and advanced technology as the keys to state power, and it is seeking power as a means of preserving its rule and ultimately extending its influence across the world.
Thank you. That's very comprehensive. In your description of global agenda, some of those concepts, I think some Canadians, many would consider those to be adversarial or not within even Canada's national interest. Is that a fair observation?
Yes, that's correct. I would say there are first of all actions that China takes that are directly antithetical to Canadian interests, and many of those have been cataloged in the media and in government reports over the last several years. One needs to step back and ask, why is the party state doing these things, right? Why the transnational repression? Why foreign interference? Why efforts to alter the effects of elections, even if they weren't ultimately successful? Why the extensive espionage? Why the repeated coercion, both through economic means, through hostage taking, other things? It's because China, the Chinese Communist Party, is trying to condition Canada's behavior to defer to Beijing's preferences and to establish a new hierarchy of power in which Canada is not simply, a helper of the United States, but rather because China views the United States in fundamentally adversarial terms. It wants to break up Western alliances. It wants to drive wedges between Western countries and ultimately deal with us individually through a dynamic in which it is by far the larger and more powerful party. And it ultimately wants to subvert and influence Canadian politics and society so that Canada doesn't do anything that is displeasing to the Chinese Communist Party. More broadly, it wants to knock America off its position as the most powerful country in the world and supplant it as the central state in world affairs. Not necessarily to take on all the burdens of hegemony and all the responsibilities, but certainly a significant amount of the power. It does not want to be able to be constrained by the United States or by any other coalition of countries. And it wants to weaken the West. This week, for example, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is in Beijing. China wants to supplant Germany as the industrial powerhouse of the world. It wants to master all of those high technologies, and it wants to use those supply chains and access to its market to condition behavior that serves its interests. And by weakening Europe, by breaking up Europe, by driving wedges between Europe and the United States and between other allies, for example, between Japan, Australia, and others, it wants to divide and conquer, not territorial conquest necessarily, as we're seeing with Russia, but certainly an increase in its own influence and to reshape the world according to its own image and views.
Very much. And so in the context that you've just described, and I only have about 30 seconds left, so it have to be a quick answer, do you think there's a risk that Parliament or the executive branch and the government is being naive about those ultimate objectives of China when they're making perhaps what seem to be nominal or small concessions or deals in the short term?
I think it's less naivete than the incentives of democratic politics, which drive the government to find quick wins and, for example, achieve relief for particular sectors like canola, and ultimately to deliver quick economic benefits and let someone else in the future worry about the long-term strategic implications. So it requires changing incentives. I don't think it's a lack of understanding, but rather the pressure to focus on short-term objectives and not worry about long-term outcomes. And that is a great risk for Canada.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fonseca for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, we can see how this committee always brings in just excellent expert witnesses, and we've just heard some testimony here from Mr. Kovrig, and we're going to hear also from Mr. Ahmadi. First to Mr. Kovrig, just on behalf of this committee and Canadians, we thank you for your service, for your commitment, for everything that you've done for our country of Canada. Like my colleague Adam Chambers, I have received many calls and emails from my constituents, and when we were going through your ordeal, and we saw so much courage and just resilience in yourself that helped our nation. So thank you for that. Mr. Ahmadi, I have a question, and it's in regards to, there was a dinner where Prime Minister Carney emphasized that Canada and China are entering a new era, a new chapter in their bilateral relationship. He described this phase as one grounded in engagement that is realistic, respectful, and ambitious, underscoring the importance of building a partnership that reflects current global realities. Now, do you believe this is an accurate statement? And what would you say to those people or countries who believe we should not be dealing with China?
Thank you for the question. So I believe that is an accurate assessment of what happened and what was achieved during this visit to China, and overall the effort by the government to recalibrate bilateral ties with China. We're moving towards an approach of pragmatic engagement with China. It doesn't mean that we do not have differences, whether it's in the economic domain or other fields and domain, security and others. Of course, there are disagreements and there are differences that need to be addressed, or guardrails that need to be set up in the relationship, whether it's, again, for economic relations and business relations, investments, trade, and others. But at the same time, especially given the condition, the situation that we're in, that we need to diversify our trade, especially because of the pressure and the challenges that we're facing with our first trading partner, the United States. We need to engage and expand our trade, our investment relationship with other major trading partners. And when we're talking about that diversification effort, our second largest trading partner is China. It is also a major source of investment for Canada. And when we look at opportunities for expanding our trade, for that diversification, for example, Export Development Canada did a comprehensive study. Where are the markets of opportunity for Canadian exporters? Asia Pacific region, because of its significant contribution to global economic growth and also its growing middle-class consumer base, always comes up as the major region that Canada needs to focus on for its diversification efforts and to expand its trade beyond the United States. But in Asia Pacific region, when we talk about different countries and different markets, China is on top of that list. Still, China represents more than 50% of opportunities that exist for Canadian businesses, for Canadian exporters. So that shows once again the significance of the Chinese market for Canadian businesses and Canadian exporters, and those 400,000 jobs that right now are tied to economic relations with China.
Mr. Ahmadi, looking at the agri-food sector, so how does Canada strengthen food security cooperation while protecting our domestic producers?
So the agreements that were reached during this trip, I believe, did a fair job. There is still a lot that needs to be done. However, these were good agreements first positive steps toward at least resolving some of the challenges that were created due to the tariffs and counter tariffs, especially during the previous federal government. Again, some of the tariffs have been reduced, but there is a time limit. For example, on the current agreements that were reached, the tariffs that have been reduced or eliminated are only going till end of 2026. And a good thing about what was achieved is that we've now established and restored some of those dialogue mechanisms. JETC was even established before this visit, the Joint Economic and Trade Commission, but we have the Economic and Financial Strategic Dialogue back on the table, the Joint Agriculture Committee, so that we can discuss, both governments can discuss and resolve existing challenges and talk about ways to expand collaboration, whether it's in the agri-food sector or other sectors that are important for our bilateral relationship, that we can restore market access, that we can expand opportunities for Canadian businesses and exporters.
Thank you. And now to Mr. Kovrig. You mentioned in your remarks tactical sector specific. And so how should Canada operationalize this strategic realism that we are in, and how to do it tactically?
Right. So the framework I would start with, right, is that for the Chinese Communist Party, economic outcomes are geopolitical outcomes on a path to revise the international power hierarchy and to gain political and strategic advantages over Canada. So where individual firms are obviously looking to profit maximize and seek opportunities, the role the government needs to play and civil society needs to play is to really impose a net benefit test on any kind of significant investment or new trade deal, right? It requires calculating asymmetric costs and benefits because the benefits are going to be concentrated in a few companies, communities, and shareholders. But if to manage those benefits, Canada then has to spend more on national defense, on the security agencies, on preventing foreign espionage and influence. That's diffused across all taxpayers. And so that, I think, needs to be, first of all, part of the calculation. Secondly, obviously, there are a number of different mechanisms to assess it. I'm not suggesting that there should be total decoupling or no trade with China. Trade with China can continue in non-sensitive sectors that don't touch on, for example, military technology, dual-use technologies, national security, and other things. And the improvements over the last several years in the investment screening processes, for example, that ICED has, are a critical part of that. But I think Canada needs to make sure that it has adequate outbound investment screening as well as inbound investment screening. And the other key litmus test is not so much whether or not there is trade, but the proportion of trade at the sectoral level, right? The top line number is, of course, not that large. Canada is not that dependent on trade or investment with China. It's the second largest, but it's only around 4%. What matters is that there are certain sectors that are particularly dependent. And as we've seen multiple times now, the Chinese Communist Party will weaponize that interdependence for coercive purposes to change Canadian policy. Canada then loses sovereignty and political decision-making and autonomy. So what you need to, I think, is to establish what would be a ceiling for a particular sector, let's say canola or pork or seafood. What's the most that we are willing to sell to one buyer, particularly a large buyer with hostile foreign policies? And then how do we manage to offset that by seeking other trade partners? So the role of the government there, for example, would then be to look at that given sector and incentivize more balancing trade with other more trusted partners so that if the Chinese Communist Party chooses to use that and close its market, Canada can shrug it off and survive and move on. And that way we can maximize the potential economic benefits of trade with the national security and sovereignty concerns that we have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank all of the witnesses, both of the witnesses today, for their presentations. I will continue with Mr. Kovrig as well. I think your presentation is clear. We need strict conditions for any agreement. And as you said in an interview, Ms. Pamela Wallin has said that diplomatic ties are nice, but we can't just let anything come into play. And as you said, in terms of certain sectors, you spoke about technology, for example. You could confirm that there are critical minerals, AI, supply chains, defense, etc., that present a danger. In the same interview, you also said that dialogue with China can't be just treated as technocratic or neutral dialogue, that silence on sensitive issues would often be interpreted as an just acquiescing to them. So as Bill 2 C-51 could be similar to the U.S. model that is working. We also going to hear a testimony from Uyghurs about this. But is Canada too silent? Are we not proactive enough on these issues?
Merci beaucoup pour votre...
Thank you very much for your question. I'll respond in English because I am used to discussing such topics in English.
I think, first of all, one key parameter is that what Canada's foreign policy needs to focus on regarding human rights is, first of all, understanding that it's not just simply an opportunity for political virtue signaling, or it's not a nice to have. The way the party state treats political prisoners, Canadian citizens who are detained in China, for example, ethnic minorities, citizens of Hong Kong, Taiwanese and others, the way that it engages in exceedingly repressive tactics and, in many cases, human rights violating policies against them is a preview of how that regime will treat any other country or population over which it acquires influence. And we've seen that through its efforts to coerce and put fear and intimidation into Canadian citizens on our soil, and, for example, people who have immigrated from Hong Kong. And so what we are looking to prevent is we're not simply looking to speak out. The purpose of speaking out is to prevent the abuses, to call attention to them. And ultimately, what our policies need to focus on often is specific cases and specific outcomes where we are looking to change. And I think the volume is less important than the how exactly that is achieved. And a crucial element, I think, is coordination with other like-minded governments, and ideally as many governments as possible, continuing to hold the line on norms in international fora, on multilateral documents, for example, through the UN Human Rights Committee and Human Rights Council, where China is continuing to try to erode those liberal norms, but then also focusing on specific cases of detainees or particularly egregious cases where it's possible to actually measure success. Otherwise, these often just end up being hortatory statements. Where I would, again, I think the Prime Minister and the current government are correct that quite often the most can be accomplished not through public statements, but through quiet diplomatic channels. So I would not underrate the role of quiet diplomacy. But the problem becomes when the government trades silence, for concessions and benefits from China, because that is what the Chinese Communist Party continually will try to do. It will try to buy our silence. It will offer economic benefits in return for silence on what China does in Tibet, in Xinjiang, on Taiwan, and ultimately in a whole range of other issues. And that creates a slippery slope. I think that is dangerous. But it's not so much the volume as the coordination and strategic use of statements to call out unacceptable behavior and urge changes in that behavior.
Mais par exemple, est-ce que l'entrée...
For example, if we have several Chinese-made EVs coming to our country, would there not be an issue? Well, there may not be a human rights issue or espionage or other issues, but is this safe? We know that these are very high-tech vehicles that can record our conversations, that are often produced with a lot of parts issued from forced labor. Is it a good idea to do this, even though we do have more advantageous alternatives?
Well, first of all, so far Canada has started with a small volume, but it sends a big geopolitical signal that a G7 country is reopening its electric vehicle market to China, and that ultimately tests Canada's alignment with the United States and Mexico ahead of the CUSMA review. So that has strategic implications. For individual Canadians, it's obviously also significant from a privacy and security perspective, right? Electric vehicles are essentially 2-ton cell phones traveling around the country. The Israeli government, for example, has banned them anywhere near its military sites, and that is a country that has very sophisticated levels of cybersecurity concerns. So it is absolutely necessary, if Canada is going to allow those vehicles into the country in any quantity, you would really need to consult the appropriate security agencies, CSEC and CSIS, to establish what parameters are necessary to make that secure. And that may include, for example, requiring them to have only Indigenous Canadian software and other limitations. But that is something that I think needs to be screened very carefully. So far, the United States, for example, has ruled that effective, I think it is next year, such vehicles will not be allowed into the United States if they're running Chinese software. So that in turn becomes a broader consideration, in the same way that Canada with Huawei had concerns for the United States security community as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Grillo, please, for 5 minutes.
Madame la Présidente, chers collègues, bonjour, chers
Chair, colleagues, and witnesses, hello. Thank you for being with us today, Mr. Kovrig. It's an honor to speak with you today. I would like to pay tribute to your great resilience for having spent so much time as a detainee in China in wake of political reprisal. In terms of international security, foreign affairs, well, simple. Is China a reliable partner for Canada or not?
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you very much for your question.
To thank all of you for your very kind statements about me. The support of Parliament and of all Canadians was immensely helpful to me in going through that ordeal. So I'm deeply grateful. The short answer to your question is no. The Chinese Communist Party is manifestly not a reliable partner for the fundamental reason that systemically, it's not about the individuals involved. Systemically, it does not have checks and balances, or transparency or democratic accountability. And its attitude toward the rule of law and its worldview are fundamentally different from that of any country with a Westminster-style parliament, or whether common law or civil law. The law in China and in the eyes of the Communist Party is simply another political tool, an instrument of power. And so international treaties and accords and, for example, consular agreements are just paper that are only adhered to if it is seen as being within the political interests of the Communist Party to adhere to them. So it is not a system that fundamentally respects contracts. And I can use the example of my own case, where in detaining me, China violated the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, the Canada-China Consular Agreement, and also a number of human rights covenants to which it is a signatory. And that's just one small example. It is a regime that routinely violates accords. Another example, of course, is in the South China Sea, where it ignored the ruling of the International Tribunal in a dispute with the Philippines and has proceeded to do so. So it will follow laws and rules when it is convenient for it to do so. But as we've seen, particularly with its role in the World Trade Organization, it often creates the useful semblance of being a guardian and supporter of globalization and a rules-based order, while actively undermining and exploiting it from within. And that creates critical problems for it as a potential trading or otherwise partner for Canada.
Merci, Monsieur Coburg. Êtes-vous préoccupé par
Thank
l'arrivée?
you. Are you concerned by the arrival of EVs in terms of hampering Canadian industry? Are there potential risks with respect to security in your view?
Yes, I think I would not be the only one to assess that electric vehicles pose a risk, in the same way that if we don't allow Huawei to build our 5 or 6G telecommunications backbone, why would we allow BYD to sell cars into the Canadian market? They can gather up enormous amounts of information, both on their drivers and on everyone around them. And there's ample documentation of this. Now, the key question there is whether or not Canada has the technical capabilities to mitigate those risks. For example, through cybersecurity safeguards, binding local production requirements, snapback mechanisms that would allow Canada to change a quota or close a quota if it turns out that things are not going the way we want. I think that is one crucial thing that the government's automotive initiatives and strategies seem to be incorporating, and it needs to incorporate, is that, you know, to treat this as an experiment with the capability of pulling it back and stopping it if it turns out it's going in a dangerous direction. But there are unquestionably cybersecurity risks. The issue is whether they can be mitigated, but also from an economics and trade standpoint and an investment standpoint, is it worth going to the trouble of having to do all those mitigations? Does the benefit actually outweigh the cost to the taxpayer of all those additional cybersecurity provisions? And one of my core arguments about trade with China is not that individual companies can't make some money by trading or that individual investments might not be worthwhile, but that the cost of security and mitigation measures that Canada as a whole will have to take on in order to make those investments safe, both from a cybersecurity perspective and from a political influence perspective, may end up outweighing the value of those investments in that trade.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
On to Lavoie, please, for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses, Mr. Ahmadi and Mr. Kovrig. I'm very pleased to meet you today. I think my colleagues already discussed what you went through, and you have a great deal of wisdom behind your words. And we're happy to hear this because, well, before I ask my question, I'll ask it to both of you. I'll allow you to each answer quickly. I work in banks for many years, and some of them were active in China, and I saw how they pulled their assets out of China. And now we are in a situation, well, Mr. Kovrig, I've heard what you've said, and I feel a great deal of caution is there. And in terms of companies that are saying we can't do business in China, should we go there, back there or not? And if we do so, how do we do so? We don't want to see the same things that happened in the past happen again. So I'd like to hear what you have to both say. Well, 2 minutes each quickly. What would your recommendations be? So I feel that, yes, there's interest to go back to this market, but we have to do so cautiously. So I'd like to hear what your recommendations would be. Perhaps Mr. Ahmadi first, and then Mr. Kovrig, 2 minutes each. 2 minutes each, please.
Sure. So, it's different for each different sector. In each different sector, we also need to have guardrails, and companies, of course, are first in the line to understand and consider the challenges that they face in those particular sectors that they are operating in. You mentioned the financial services sector, for example. Our banks, investment firms, asset managers, they have insurance companies, major Canadian insurance companies. They have a long-term presence in the Chinese market, and they, of course, understand the challenges that market presents. But still, because of the significant opportunities that market presents to their companies, they are present in the Chinese market and continue their participation presence in that market, and want to actually, some of them at least, want to expand their operations and their presence as well. So in each different sector, we, of course, again, need to consider the challenges and have guardrails, some of them by government, but some of them are the guardrails that businesses themselves establish to protect their operations in China. But when we look at it as a whole, again, year after year, our relationship, our trade relationship, even during the past 8 years of diplomatic and political strain and difficulties in our bilateral relationship, our bilateral trade and investment as well, when we look at the FDI stock, have relatively increased. Slow
Je vais peut-être vous arrêter, Monsieur Ahmadi, pour donner...
Sorry, I'll have to stop you there, Mr. Ahmadi, and give Mr. Kovrig an opportunity to answer as well. I see my time is running out, but thank you very much. Mr. Kovrig?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
The key concern with Canadian companies in China is, first of all, that they can essentially be held hostage through political means and become weaponized as potential points of leverage that affect Canadian policy. But as long as their investments are not proportionally too large, that's not necessarily a major concern. I mean, so at the strategic level, what I think the government needs to be doing is actively encouraging Canadian companies to invest and be involved in other markets across the Indo-Pacific, which is a large and dynamic region. So actively, the Prime Minister is traveling this week to Australia, Japan, and India. That is exactly what he needs to be doing. Increasing trade and investment opportunities with other countries in the region to balance the level of commitment that there is in China. I don't think it's at a level of forbidding investment in China or putting up barriers to it, but I don't think there's a strategic benefit to Canada to actively encouraging or incentivizing more investment in China, because the risks are often, and again, the costs of those risks are often socialized across all of Canada and the government, not just on the particular company. There is also the potential risk of a conflict with Taiwan, resulting in those countries those companies having stranded assets in China. So the geopolitical risks in China are significant. The role of the government is to ensure that Canadian companies are fully aware of them, are making prudent decisions accordingly, and also recognizing that the government, the taxpayer, is not going to bail them out if they do something that the government has not recommended that they do. But of course, the government does also need to defend the interests of its companies there. I would just argue against incentivizing more investment in the Chinese market. Realistically, in most cases, that's not likely to end well. And there is a key concern of sectoral and business and elite capture through political influence. And that is really the key danger, that the Chinese Communist Party can turn companies that are invested in China into advocates for its own interests. It can create reciprocity traps for them. And so that risk also needs to be managed and mitigated.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, Monsieur Kovrig. Alors, continuons.
Mr. Kovrig, let's continue our discussion where we left it off earlier. First, you discussed the EV issue, but we know there's a lot of forced labor that comes into play from Xinjiang, even though it's another region or a new territory. The Uyghurs don't really appreciate this, but let's use this in terms of our discussion. Do you think Canada should not strengthen its legislation with respect to border control and merchandise coming into Canada?
Merci beaucoup. Une très bonne question.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question.
Important issue of supply chains, right? The reality is that there are significant risks of environmental damage that would not be tolerable within Canada in the supply chains of a lot of these supposedly clean and green, new energy technologies like batteries and vehicles. And also, for example, in the mining process that extracts a lot of the rare earths and other things. So one of the cost advantages that China has is that it doesn't have many of the same environmental standards that Canada has. So I would say that any strictures on trade or investment by those companies needs to ensure for the Canadian consumer that if I'm a Canadian buying an electric vehicle or making use of Chinese batteries, to make sure that they have acceptable supply chains, both from an environmental perspective and from a human rights perspective. There are the United Nations and multiple independent civil society organizations have reported on severe problems of forced labor in China, and I think Canadians need to be assured that if they are buying a Chinese electric vehicle or other product, that it was not made with slave labor and it did not pollute and devastate a natural environment somewhere that would be in a way that would be deemed unacceptable in Canada.
Donc, il faudrait renforcer la loi.
So we need to strengthen our legislation in this respect. Exactly, yes. Now, how much time do I have left? We've recently learned that there was an agreement with Taiwan, but we're just waiting for it to be signed, and this is on the PM's desk. we can't assume this, but that we think it will not please China. Do we think an agreement with Taiwan would be something we would want?
Yes, I think it's actually quite important, in fact, to continue to move forward with agreements with Taiwan, and we should be actively deepening Canada's support for and engagement with Taiwan, and maintain a polite diplomatic stance with China that doing so, as long as those things are within the parameters of Canadian foreign policy guidelines on the One China policy, there is no reason why Canada should not be able to do those things. And indeed, Canada should also be encouraging like-minded democracies and allies to be strengthening ties with Taiwan. It should, we should not accept a false dichotomy that Beijing would want to force on Canada, that we must choose between relations between China and Taiwan when we are talking about commercial agreements on trade and investment, for example.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chambers, for 5 minutes. We're going to go slightly over. Okay, Mr. McKenzie.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll add to my colleagues here on this committee my thanks to both of these witnesses. Your knowledge and your expertise is greatly appreciated. Mr. Kovrig, the circumstances that we've seen here unfold in the last number of months, the fact that China closed its borders to canola exports from Canada inflicted very serious economic harm on Western Canadian farmers primarily. They have now utilized this economic hostage strategy to great effect. We've opened our borders to EVs. Can we expect more of that treatment in a broadening relationship with China?
Very likely, yes.
Thank you, sir. I want to ask you about China shocks, something you've written about, China Shock 1.0 and China Shock 2.0. And I think the example of the EVs that are now going to be imported to Canada perhaps dovetail directly into these subject areas. Could you explain China shocks?
Sure. Yeah. So this is essentially some of these are natural processes. It's a growing Chinese economy and Chinese producers moving up a value chain and gradually competing with industries in other countries. Some of that is a natural process that we also see in other developing countries. But what's distinctive about particularly the current China shock is that it's driven to a great extent by massive state subsidies and industrial policies that have deliberately, under banners including the Made in China 2025 and dual circulation and others, it's part of an explicit policy by China to dominate key sectors like biotechnology, robotics, advanced manufacturing, green technology, and to make China the dominant producer of those technologies, while at the same time making other countries dependent on China for those technologies and reducing China's dependence on others. So it's leveraging productive capacity for geopolitical purposes. This is ultimately driven both by ideological and domestic political economy dynamics. China heavily incentivizes production and manufacturing because the Chinese Communist Party views that as a source of comprehensive state power. So it's a massive wealth transfer from Chinese citizens through low interest rates in their bank accounts, for example, and taxation, funneled into Chinese industry, which then makes those Chinese companies much more competitive on an international market than any Western company, because those companies don't have, in many cases, don't have to worry about turning a profit. They're getting such cheap land and low taxation and credit and other resources, and they're plugging into vast industrial scale clusters. So there are economies of scale. There are advantages of learning by doing. A whole host of things pile up to make this an industrial juggernaut. And for countries like Germany, for example, this has become existential. The China shock is essentially, the first China shock was a deindustrialization of somewhat lower value added manufacturing in the US and Southern Europe and other countries about 10, 20 years ago. The current China shock is now decimating the most advanced manufacturing in the world. So it's affecting, for example, American automakers, it's drones, battery makers. It's affecting every German car maker. There are massive layoffs in Germany. And the risk here is both economic and strategic. If you deindustrialize a country, you lose a lot of quality jobs, you lose the ecosystem, you lose the process knowledge and expertise that makes you capable of producing the advanced technologies of the 21st century. What happens if there's a war? Are you going to have the capacity to build the necessary materials for tanks, for armored cars, for weapons? Are you still going to have the skilled labor that can produce those things? And you're also going to ultimately suffer in terms of lost productivity, because it's much harder to drive productivity in service and agricultural sectors than in manufacturing. So there are a whole host of negative externalities that come along with a loss of a manufacturing base and industry, and that in turn accrue to China. A further benefit of that much industrial gravity, and here we are talking about China alone, potentially in the next few years, producing 40% of all global manufacturing. That provides massive economies of scale, it provides geopolitical leverage, and it ultimately puts China in a position to disseminate its own standards and norms and ideologies through that technology. So it's an immensely powerful tool of influence.
Thank you very much. Madame Lapointe, please, for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Merci au
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the witnesses today. What you're saying is very interesting. We love hearing your perspectives. What you've just said, Mr. Kovrig, well, geopolitical risks our Prime Minister's speech at Davos is trying to bring together middle powers. What you said, you're talking about de-industrialization. Well, you're saying we could risk losing our specialized workforce. It's not just Germany. We could also lose our high-tech sector, because in China for more than 20 years, we no longer have the same projects there. We're going to become vulnerable with this high-tech. So you've also referred to, well, yes, doing business with China, but also creating allies with other Indo-Pacific countries. How should we move forward in that respect?
Recognizing that a key driver of the Trump administration's policies, and indeed the Biden administration's policies before them, was to promote the reindustrialization of the United States. Some of that is because they are looking to restore quality jobs in manufacturing, but realistically with automation, the effect on employment is limited. What it's more about is strategic purposes, to make sure to identify the key industries that the United States or Canada or any country needs to be able to source and produce either itself domestically, or in the case of Canada, which doesn't necessarily have the scale of the United States, from a reliable partner or multiple reliable partners, to ensure that we can have those goods, whether it's, for example, protective equipment during a pandemic, or machine tools, or critical technology, or, for example, silicon chips, right? In the case of the Taiwan conflict, is Silicon Valley ready for suddenly losing access to that quantity of microprocessors? I don't think so. And so what Canada needs to do is ensure that it has multiple partnerships with other reliable countries. And certainly for high technology, the Indo-Pacific is a key place to do it. South Korea, Japan, Australia for certain specialized things, Southeast Asia for production often of lower cost items, European countries for other specialized items. Canada needs to be ensuring that it has secure supply chains. And if that currently means diversifying away from the United States, it also means not becoming newly more dependent on China for supply of those things. It's about, and the tragedy of this, of course, from an economic perspective, is this is expensive. It's cheap and the reason why China became so dominant and we had that China shock was that it was cheap and easy to make everything in China and ship it elsewhere. That's okay until you have geopolitical differences and you discover that Beijing likes to weaponize interdependence. And that unfortunately requires Canada and other countries to absorb certain costs by diversifying its supply chains for critical technologies and choosing which ones we want to inculcate and cultivate ourselves at home. It's about stepping back and thinking, what kind of an economy does Canada want to have? Do we want to be the Argentina of the 21st century, primarily reliant on agricultural commodities and energy, or do we actually want to have the advanced manufacturing sector and technological capacity of a G7 country?
Merci, c'est très intéressant. Vous avez
What you're saying
parlé...
is very interesting. Earlier, you talked about, yes, doing business with them. We can sell them our pork and canola, but we need to have a ceiling for such sales to not become vulnerable with just one buyer and breaking our market if we just sell our products in China. So what would the ceiling be, that, in your opinion? How should we limit things?
But ultimately, I mean, the question that you have to ask a business is, if you lost 1/3 of your business, let's say, could you survive? It's a bit like, a stock market investor, right? If you have all your money in only 3 stocks and one of them goes to zero, are you going to be insolvent? Are you going to lose your house? So it would need to be done. That kind of calculation would need to be done at the individual firm level. But I think where the government could help, in various ways, is by developing frameworks and litmus tests and geopolitical guidance for how risky a market is and for how to factor in that kind of political risk into business decisions. And to some extent, there may be ways of mitigating that, for example, through sectoral or regional or national insurance programs and so on, right? I mean, the agricultural sector already benefits from certain mechanisms to provide insurance against things like shifts in climate and weather and bad growing seasons. This is another risk that needs to be factored in with mechanisms, but also, I think, evaluating mechanism. I mean, at a ballpark, I would say you would not want, if I were running a company, I wouldn't want more than 1/3 of my sales being dependent on China or any other sort of market that is in a position to weaponize it geopolitically. You want to be able to survive and move on and diversify.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses, Mr. Amadi, Mr. Kovrig. Thank you very much. Very valuable information that you provided for the committee today. We will now suspend for 2 minutes for our witnesses for the next panel to come up, please. individual, Charles Burton, Senior Fellow, Synopsis. And from the Canadian Canola Growers Association, Dustin Pike, Vice President, Government and Industry Relations. And I believe Brittany Wood, Senior Policy Manager for Trade and Transportation by video conference. And the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, Mehdi Toti, the Executive Director. Welcome to you all. Appreciate you being here. Mr. Burton, I will turn the floor up to you for up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, if you like, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Last year, this government announced a recalibration of our relations with China. In practice, this meant bowing to Beijing's pressure, adopting the Chinese Communist Party's own terminology by labeling our relationship a strategic partnership. What Canada has always wanted from China is straightforward: a greater share of its vast market for Canadian goods and services. Successive governments have chased this dream. Prime Minister Chrétien championed Team Canada missions, prioritizing trade while downplaying serious concerns over human rights violations. Every leader, up to Justin Trudeau, has tied our economic future to increasing exports to China. Yet we must face the reality of our failure in this endeavor. In 2024, exports to China represented a mere 3.8% of our total global exports. That's $29.9 billion. This is a fraction of the windfall that Canadians could have reasonably expected when China's policies of opening and reform began 4 decades ago. To put this into perspective, our exports to the European Union stand at 4.8%, or 34.5 billion Canadian dollars. We do better with Europe than we do with the much-touted economic miracle of China. Now the government hopes Mr. Carney can succeed where a generation of leaders has fallen short. He will not. The mercantilists in Beijing will never allow Canadian imports to compete fairly against Chinese domestic products, particularly now as China's economy languishes under Xi Jinping's anti-market status policies. Madam Chair, we must stop treating China as a traditional nation-state. It is a conglomerate of state, industry, and the military security apparatus, entirely unified under the Chinese Communist Party. At the 19th Party Congress last decade, Xi Jinping made this explicitly clear by stating, "Party, government, military, civilian, and academic, north, south, east, west, and center, the party leads everything." When Beijing demands a strategic partnership, they are demanding our collaboration in enabling their overall geostrategic purposes. Nothing illustrates this danger more than the recent agreement signed in Beijing, a Memorandum of Understanding on Cooperation in Combating Crimes. This entails the RCMP and China's Ministry of Public Security exchanging data, intelligence, and best practices. Canada gains almost nothing from this agreement. However, the data the Chinese now expect us to hand over poses a severe threat to our national security and to the diaspora communities within our borders, particularly Canadians of Uyghur and Tibetan origin. Furthermore, sharing our best practices simply hands Chinese security agencies the very information they need to understand the RCMP's techniques and exploit our vulnerabilities in countering foreign subversion from China. And what is the price of our compliance? A temporary canola tariff reduction that expires at the end of the year, vague MOUs on energy and clean tech, an upgraded bilateral Joint Economic and Trade Commission with trade ministers meeting annually. These are not diplomatic victories. They are economic leverage. The government is under immense pressure to not displease Beijing. This means turning a blind eye to espionage agents, permitting Chinese regime investment in our critical infrastructure, stalling effective measures like a robust foreign influence registry to expose Beijing's proxies operating on Canadian soil. Madam Chair, handing over our security apparatus's data and remaining silent on foreign subversion in exchange for fleeting, fractional trade benefits is a profound miscalculation. I am deeply concerned that this government's recent memoranda and its so-called strategic relationship with China are not and will never be of net benefit to Canada. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks the interpreters, excellent interpreters of this committee for their work.
Mr. Pike and Ms. Wood for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for the invitation. It's great to see agriculture a focus of the International Trade Committee. My name is Dustin Pike, and it's great to be here in person. I'm here with my colleague, Brittany Wood, attending virtually in Winnipeg. The Canadian Canola Growers Association represents 40,000 canola farmers driving issues, policies, and programs that impact their farm success. Developed in Canada, canola is a Canadian success story of research and innovation. Canola is a strong economic contributor to family farms and our rural communities. In 2024, canola continued to be the #1 source of revenue for farmers, earning $12.9 billion, accounting for 25% of the total crop receipts, with 90% of the crop being exported as seed, oil, or meal. Annually, the canola sector contributes $43.7 billion to the Canadian economy and provides over 200,000 jobs. The United States and China are #1 and #2 most important markets, representing 87% of total canola exports. However, in 2025, this number dropped to 61%, largely due to the tariffs put in place in March and August of 2025. Japan, Mexico, United Arab Emirates, and the EU make up much of the additional export opportunity in recent years, but there is no denying the buying power of the USA and China. Canola farmers were very encouraged to receive news on January 16 of the agreement reached between Canada and China to provide significant tariff relief for Canadian canola seed and meal. And we greatly appreciate the efforts and results of PM Carney, his cabinet, government officials, and also Premier Scott Moe to reestablish trade with our second largest export market. Under the agreement reached, tariffs on Canadian canola seed imports are expected to be reduced to a combined rate of 15%, down from 75.8%, as of March 1st, 2026. And the current 100% tariffs on canola meal are expected to be completely removed until at least the end of the calendar year. While this is significant progress, there is still work to do. 100% tariffs on canola oil remain in place, and the long-term predictable tariff relief on all canola products are a must. In 2024, exports of canola to China were valued at $4.9 billion compared to only $2 billion last year. With much of the 2025 crop stored on the farm and planting of the 2026 crop quickly approaching, canola farmers are looking for predictability and confidence in their ability to market their canola. Unfortunately, the measure of success will be reliable resumption of canola movement to China this spring. Beyond China, Canadian farmers continue to value the open trading relationship with a renewed CUSMA. This has allowed Canadian seed, oil, and meal to continue to be exported tariff-free to the U.S. and Mexico, while also allowing for import of critical inputs to the industry. While the U.S. and China are critical markets for canola, our best opportunity for market diversification and stability is right here at home, through the advancement of a competitive, made-in-Canada biofuel industry. By supplying canola feedstock to an expanding biofuel sector, this is very important. Currently, canola is just over 20% of feedstock for the biofuels industry, but we can do better. On September 5th, the Prime Minister announced potential biofuel support measures related to tariff action to assist Canada's canola industry, and they need to be taken seriously at Environment and Climate Change Canada. At present, the proposed amendments fail to include concrete proposals that will help secure additional domestic demand for canola as biofuel feedstock. Additionally, concerns remain about potential compliance risks within the CFR related to foreign used cooking oil from Asia, accounting for a significant portion of Canadian feedstock. Biofuels is a marriage of energy and agriculture, and we can do both well here. All we need is a government that recognizes farmers for playing a vital role in strengthening our energy security, driving rural economic growth, and building a more sustainable future for our country. Again, thank you for the invitation on appearing on this very important issue for farmers. I look forward to the committee further recognizing canola as a vitally important commodity for farmers as we strengthen and expand our market success. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pike. Okay, we will go to Mr. Tati, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Madam Chair and honorable members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Mehmet Tohti, Executive Director of the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project based in Ottawa. Canada stands at the final moment in its trade policy. Choices we make are not only about exports or market access, but about who we are as a democracy and how seriously we defend human rights. When democracies set aside rights for short-term economic gain, history shows the long-term costs, vulnerability, lost credibility, and weakened alliances. Canada's trade diversification makes sense, but it must rest on evidence, enforceable standards, and alliance realities, not political optimism. Expanding trade with China, in particular, carries substantial risk. Beijing continues to use commerce as a leverage to divide allies and weaken unified positions on human rights. Without strong safeguards, deeper engagement could erode our alignment with the United States and other Western alliance and compromise our security. Just a week ago, February 2026 Jimmy Stan Foundation report identified 575 Chinese Communist Party-linked United Front organizations in Canada, marking our country as a key hub for foreign interference. These networks influence policymaking, mobilize political support for Beijing's interest, and target dissidents like myself, Uyghur Canadians, Tibetans, Hong Kongers through transnational repression. Trade and policy decisions cannot be separated from this growing interference. Canada's recent approval for BYD, a Chinese state-linked automaker, to expand operations illustrates the danger of narrow economic reasoning. Independent reports show BYD's involvement in high-risk regions such as the East Turkestan Uyghur region and the Tibet, where forced labor and state-imposed labor transfer programs operate under coercive conditions. Between 2017 and 2019, at least 80,000 Uyghurs were forcibly transferred to factories across China. This system now spans more than 17 global industries, including textiles, solar energy, electronics, mining, and automotive supply chains. Engaging firms tied to those networks without strict due diligence risks complicity in forced labor, a practice the Canadian Parliament has recognized as a part of an ongoing genocide against Uyghurs. Beyond human rights, this is a national security issue. Chinese electric vehicles and smart technologies integrate sensors and softwares connect to China-based infrastructure, creating real surveillance and data integrity concerns. Canada has already acted on similar risks, ordering Hikvision to end operations under Canada Investment Act. The same logic must apply to BYD. Enforcement remains a weak link. Since 2020, Canada has detained only 48 shipments suspected of using Uyghur forced labor, while U.S. enforcement under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act blocked billions in goods. Without comparable action, Canada risks becoming a diversion market for banned products, undermining North American alignment. Lastly, Canada cannot ignore hostage diplomacy. Hussein Jalil, Canadian citizen and Uyghur activist, has been imprisoned in China since 2006, 20 years, denied consular access, and denied the recognition of his citizenship. His ongoing detention exemplifies Chinese use of human beings as an instrument of state policy. Madam Chair, engagement with China must not come at the cost of integrity or human dignity. Canada's trade policy must be guided by principles, accountability, and security. To proceed otherwise would endanger our alliances, our values, and the Canadians who expect their government to stand on the side of justice. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Very much. Mr. McKenzie for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. As you describe risks in doing business with China, all of you, I must admit that I'm more frightened than I was when I arrived this morning. It strikes me that we all see the allure of a large China market, but must keep in mind what the risks are in dealing with China. Mr. Burton, if I might start with you, you've talked about elite capture. When I consider the new approach of our Prime Minister entering into a strategic relationship, a strategic partnership, as I believe he called it, and being mindful of the risks that you've described, are you concerned about a strategic partnership between Canada and China?
Yes, I am very concerned that the way that China understands the strategic partnership is different from the way it's been downplayed as simply language here in Canada. China sees our function as to support enabling their overall geostrategic purposes, which is, as Mr. Kovrig very articulately said this morning, the community of the common destiny of mankind, which is China's plan to achieve domination of the global order by 2050 in the context of China's assumption that the United States is a power in decline. So, you know, I'm concerned that our government would go along with this, that in the Great Hall of the People facing Xi Jinping, our Prime Minister would make reference to the new world order, which, when you're saying it in the Great Hall of the People to Xi Jinping, clearly sends a signal to the Chinese that we are affirming their vision of the global future, which is a China-dominated global future with the kinds of enormous costs to our Canadian values and ways of life that Mr. Kovrig said just earlier this morning.
The deal that was mentioned a bit earlier today, that being the reduction of punitive tariff measures that were put in place on Canadian exports of canola, Mr. Pike's clients and members and farmers. And in return for that, China was successful through an economic hostage-taking move, obtaining access to Canada for electric vehicles. Picking up on something that Mr. Kovrig talked about, and that being China shocks, I want to underline what I understand to be the Chinese practice. We're not talking about China working conjunctively within China to obtain some market advantage or economies of scale. Indeed, it employs state subsidies in a very specific and targeted manner. Now, those kind of subsidies at that kind of level, they're not intended to gain a slight advantage. They're intended to not just dominate, but to decimate the importing country's domestic market. And not just dominate and decimate, but eliminate and hollow out, to use the words of Mr. Kovrig. And I wonder if we are understanding that, particularly when there's been suggestions that these importations now might lead to Chinese manufacture here in Canada. I see that as a pipe dream, and I wonder, sir, if you could comment.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that China has this idea of state-to-state fair and reciprocal trade. You know, one suspects that the massive Chinese state subsidies to the EV sector is similar to the motivation for their massive subsidies to the Huawei company, which is that the investment pays back in the espionage and infrastructure information that would accrue. So, you know, in addition to the idea that they can listen to what you're saying in your car and that they can know a lot about the driver and so on, it also provides information about where the car goes, which I think, you know, in the next conflict with China will be critically important in the sense that, the next war we have with China will not be about Canada sending bombs to blow up buildings in faraway countries, but that the concerns that the CSE and other agencies have raised about China's products in Canada, including, say, the TP-Link routers, will mean that it will impact us directly here. The bank machines won't work. There was a warning, I think it was by an agency here, about China's possible control of water filtration systems. The idea that Mr. Kovrig raised about the possibility of us being able to control the software on the EVs, I'm not sure how feasible that is, in the sense that all these things, as you know from your computers, are being updated continuously from the manufacturer. And we do have the example of subway cars in Boston a few years ago, Chinese manufacturer, where they found out that the doors could be controlled from Nanjing in China. I don't think that China would agree to us having control over those EVs because of what I said. They're subsidizing them heavily because they provide a benefit. And the other one that you talk about, which is the devastation of our own auto industry by these heavily subsidized things, and as Kovrig pointed out, the Chinese can afford to lose money for a long time, is another way for them to gain more economic leverage over us for their other purposes. In other words, we're not going to be expelling Chinese agents of espionage or tightening up on gray area activities for the transfer of dual-use military technologies or exposing the Chinese proxies through an effective registry if that would then lead to Chinese retaliation in the trade aspects.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. McKenzie. You've gone a bit over there. Mr. Napke, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. And I want to thank the witnesses earlier as well. It's been a very thoughtful discussion, so I sincerely appreciate it. I want to just put one thing on the record, just to clarify that the agreement with China does not talk about EVs from a particular manufacturer. It just talks about 49,000 EVs. They could be from any manufacturers. Just wanted to make sure that we don't leave with understanding that we had an agreement with one particular manufacturer in China. As I'm listening to the conversation, one thing is clear to me, and I think that's what Mr. Kovrig was trying to say, that he wasn't saying that don't engage with China. I think I heard him saying, and what he has been writing, that strategic relationship with China is important, but do so with eyes wide open and make sure that there are appropriate guardrails in place. Do you agree, Mr. Burton and Mr. Thodi, with that sentiment?
I'm sure Mehmet has a lot to say about this. Both of us, as you may know, have been sanctioned by the Chinese regime for no good reason. I think that I think if trade occurs just for trade purposes, that's great. I mean, if you take the example of Australia and China, when Australia started to make noises that China should be more forthcoming about the origins of COVID-19, China then put a number of arbitrary restrictions on the import of Australian commodities into China. This went on for a while until China recognized that they really do need Australian iron ore. Iron ore is by far the largest commodity sent from Australia, and took it off. So, I think if China needs a Canadian product and is prepared to accept it without these non-trade strings attached, which, are very big in the joint statement between Canada and China with respect to Mr. Carney's recent visit, great. I see about the pet food. Does China need Canadian pet food and can't get pet food elsewhere? If that's the case, and they're prepared to pay for our pet food, more power to them. But I do think that China is typically trying to weaponize these trade relationships to achieve other aims. And if that is the case, then I think we simply have to say we'll sell our pet food elsewhere.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, if you remember when COVID started and China started to use PPE and weaponized PPE, and we experienced that one as well. So any trade, when we became dependency on China, that is dangerous, and it can be used against our national interests. And for that reason, yes, we need to have a trade. China is our trading partner, going to be second largest trading partner. And there are a lot of areas, and we are a trading nation. We have commodities to sell. But at the same time, we have to remember just a basic humanitarian compassionate basis. 20 years passed since the illegal detention of Hussein Jalil. That Chinese government that we are going to establish security partnership did not allow a single-time consular access for Hussein Jalil, did not allow a single-time phone conversation between that gentleman, Hussein Jalil, under Chinese custody and their family members and the children. We are talking about 20 years, just single time. Still, we don't know he's alive or dead. And that China did not recognize his Canadian citizenship. And that China put bounty on Canadians on Canadian soil. And that China expanded the transnational repression on Canadian soil and expanded, installed police stations all across China. Just recent Jamestown Foundation report, for that reason it is important, 575 directly linked to Chinese Communist Party's organizations operating in Canada. And for that reason, we had to keep our eyes open. At the same time, we have to adopt some sort of measures to counter those direct attacks to Canada.
Thank you. And I think appreciate the caution. We can also not have this discussion pretending or thinking that the world hasn't changed around us. I mean, everybody's been speaking about weaponizing your commercial power. Well, we're seeing our biggest friend and ally has weaponized our market access to them against us as well. So, I mean, we find ourselves in a very unique circumstance. And Mr. Pike, I will come to you from a perspective of the farmers that you represent. What are your advice to the Canadian government in terms of creating those market opportunities for canola farmers, be it United States and China that you spoke of as number one and number two markets, but other markets as well?
Right. Thank you for the question. I would really reiterate what the last panel has said. We're no different from other organizations, other commodity groups, that China is, the second largest market. It's very important. I would say I'm not going to get into geopolitical dynamics of things, but definitely not here to pit commodity versus commodity. But I would say there's a lot of frustration amongst farmers. Still a lot of uncertainty. And this is the case with our 40,000 canola farmers across the country. And there are ways to market diversify and look into other opportunities. We have relationships with Japan, Mexico, the UAE, Europe, but there's a lot more work to be done. You might have seen recently we had some success in Pakistan. Those on-the-ground relationships are very important. But, as far as Canada is concerned, as I mentioned in my preamble, there's a lot that we can do right here. Currently, a lot of, the canola seed that goes into our biofuel systems is only about 20% of the ingredient commodity is canola. So we can do a lot better there to strengthen ourselves here at home to provide that market diversity.
Can I ask a very quick question as a follow-up?
Sorry,
no. I thought
your time is
she
up.
looked at me as in like, you've got 2 more minutes, Yasser.
No, but I was very intent on listening to Mr. Pike and his comments, and we would hope that those suggestions to expand the market here in Canada are also explored. Okay, Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, please, for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses today. First, Mr. Torti, thank you for your testimony because you're speaking on behalf of a community that has been subject to a genocide, and this has been recognized.
Okay,
Là,
Mr.
ça fonctionne?
Savard-Tremblay?
Mr. Savard-Tremblay, please start again. Okay. So, Mr. Tati, you belong to a community that was subject to a true genocide, and it was recognized by the House of Commons unanimously. So I'd like to thank you for your testimony today about the importance of preventing the entry of products subject to forced labor produced in China. You discussed the weaknesses of Canada in terms of filtering these products at the border. And obviously, you know that in the U.S. there is a law called the Uyghur Act that is very effective. Well, there are many laws, but one called the Uyghur Act that is very effective. I tabled a bill to C251, rather, to harmonize our legislation with the U.S. Can you call for the adoption of this legislation that I have tabled?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that initiative. It is important legislative work that Canada has promised a number of times in the Parliament to undertake. And lastly, on December 16, 2024, during the fall economic statement, the previous government promised to pass that legislation. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and this is going to be an important issue when we really start the CUSMA negotiations, because as part of the CUSMA agreement, Canada not only promised, just it is part of the agreement, should ban any products made by the use of forced labor and child labor. And unfortunately, we didn't do that. So that is the gap we need to fill, and I hope all parliamentarians support your bill, and the government should support that bill, and it makes our negotiation much easier with the United States. It is important for Canada's interest as well, and I truly support your bill. Thank you.
Sachez que le comité a adopté unanimement.
The committee has unanimously adopted a motion just recently, in the past week, to remind the government of its promise to work for such legislation. Mr. Burton, do you think it's a good idea to have such legislation? Or do we need more binding provisions with respect to forced labor?
Oh, I think we should have absolutely no tolerance for products of forced labor. And I think Mehmet has made this point before, that it's incumbent on the importers to demonstrate that the products are not subject to forced labor, particularly coming from the Uyghur regions. And, you know, and in addition, when you look at lithium mining, it's not, in addition to the Uyghur areas, there's also concerns about Tibet. So, you know, we have not been very effectively implementing the measures, and there have been great difficulties in us being able to stop products that we believe are from forced labor, textiles in particular, and legal challenges that have made the legislation not achieve its purpose, which is to protect children and the oppressed minorities in China from being compelled to engage in slave labor. I really feel that this is an area in which all Canadians very strongly support, even if this means that we suffer some economic consequences. I mean, you know, it really is a matter of, you know, we may win the world, but what about our soul? And I think that maintaining a Canadian identity is very important. Maybe Mehmet has more to say on this topic.
Ben, je voudrais faire une mention. Merci d'avoir amené aussi le Tibet.
Thank you very much for mentioning Tibet. We don't talk about it enough when we talk about goods from forced labor. Your last sentence interests me because you said we can win in some respects, but we lose our soul. So aside from the humanitarian aspects, there seems to be some unloyal competition because they also compete with our products, even though they are not subject to deplorable conditions. Even economically, we're not winning.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, obviously, if they're not paying the workers, including children, for producing things, the cost of production goes down, and that is an unfair competition. It's similar to the provisions that we don't allow the import of products of prison labor into Canada because the prisoners are not being properly compensated for their work. I think that these are very important principles that we should stand up against opposition from economic elements that would prefer that we do allow these cheaper products produced through environmental violations and appalling violations of internationally recognized labor standards.
Monsieur Totti, vous vouliez ajouter quelque chose, je crois?
Did you want to add something, Mr. Totti?
Points, and I said it is important for our national interest because when we continue to purchase products made by the use of forced labor, we undermine our own manufacturing industries, and it affects the pocket of Canadians directly. And the second, it undermines our principles and trilateral agreements we put our signature on, just like CUSMA. And the previous government and they studied and they drafted two bills. One is importment legislation, another one is human rights on due diligence on supply chain legislation, and somehow it is not tabled. And so your bill is important. It is compatible to UFLPA, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so I urge our parliamentarians and especially government MPs should push this bill to be passed, and it can strengthen the hand of the Canadian government when we have a negotiation with the United States.
Thank you very much. Mr. Grillo, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Chers
Thank
invités,
you,
bonjour.
Chair. Good afternoon. Mr. Burton, you have a lot of experience as a researcher. You were an advisor to the Canadian Embassy in China, so we can say you know China very well. You said that China has other motivations than Canada's economic growth. They're thinking more of themselves, obviously. But do they have a hidden agenda? And if so, what is it?
Yes, I was educated in China, and I had two postings as a Canadian diplomat, and I've also had experience with the Communications Security Establishment in my career. I go back 50 years in terms of China to the Cultural Revolution period and have lived there for extensive lengths of time. Unfortunately, as I just mentioned, due to the sanctions, I'm not able to return. And in any event, I had previously been detained in China and had left the country without permission. In any event, do they have an agenda? Yes, they have an agenda. And the agenda is that China feels deep resentment over history. Mr. Xi Jinping talks a lot about history and the Opium Wars of 1840 and the idea that China should be the predominant civilization on the planet and the other nations should be subordinate to China. And I think that they have their Belt and Road Initiative, which is to reorient the global economy towards China at the center, and that Canada would be a part of this, providing natural resources and, they say to feed the dragon, that kind of thing. And this politically corresponds with their program of the Community of the Common Destiny of Mankind, where they debase the role of multilateral institutions designed to promote fairness and sovereignty between states with a Chinese vision of great power makes right. And so, that is their agenda. There's no question about it. They don't believe in international law, as Mr. Kovrig pointed out. They see it as a means to be instrumental in furthering their overall goals. And their activities in Canada are oriented towards the long term for a future opportunity for China to further its dominance. I would say that this is the policy of the Chinese Communist Party under Chairman Xi, Party General Secretary Xi. I don't think it necessarily represents the aspirations of the Chinese people. So I am hoping that in the future there may be a change in China where they will become a responsible stakeholder in global affairs and want to cooperate with the nations of the world as opposed to undermine democracies and seek their dominance over foreign nations.
Merci beaucoup. Tout à l'heure, j'ai posé la question.
Thank you. Earlier, I asked a question, and to someone else, I'll ask you to you as well. We're talking about 45,000 EVs coming in from China. Well, we talked about cybersecurity. Well, let's be honest. In terms of China, Iran, Russia, they are not perhaps our greatest allies. So how much security would we need? We need sizable security with the arrival of such vehicles?
Yes, I mean, we need to be devoting a terrific amount of effort to be looking at all the millions of lines of code in software and monitoring what these EVs are sending back to a hostile power. Is the government prepared to pay those costs to monitor those vehicles to ensure that they aren't undermining Canada's security and sovereignty interests? I'm completely thrown by this. And of course, the other one is that Canadians apparently will not be allowed to drive them into the United States. So they'll only be useful, to getting around our own country, not for driving yourself down to your condo in Florida. I think it's an enormous miscalculation on the part of the government and does really make me question the what interests our leaders are serving. Are they Canadian national interests, or are they serving some limited business interests that have strong political connections?
Thank you very much. Mr. Fonseca for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is the International Trade Committee. And as you know, Canadians, Canada is a trading nation. We're about 0.5% of the world's population, but we're 2.5% of the world's trade. Now, in my area, I can tell you we don't have a lot of agriculture. I'm in Mississauga is where my riding is, although we do have a lot of agriculture manufacturing. I talked about it at one of our previous meetings, Erie Meats, which employs 1,500 people. But I can tell you over the last number of years, many of those that have come and advocated at my office here on the Hill have been agriculture producers. So I've had the Canadian Canola Growers Association. I'm glad Mr. Pike is here, and I've had many others. And they're, for the most part, from provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, our heartland, where a lot of canola is grown, and others. And the advocacy has always been, how can we get past this? How can we get an agreement? How can we lower those tariffs? I spoke to many, actually, most of the people I spoke to in terms of my colleagues were conservative members, and conservative members kept asking, we've got to get something done with China to be able to move forward. Well, I believe that Prime Minister Carney has come in with a pragmatic approach to addressing this. If in his speech at Davos, he talked about, we see the world as it is. I'm paraphrasing, not as we would hope that it would be. So the approach that has been taken as one that, in actually what Mr. Kovrig was talking about, I think is quite tactical to address the tariffs when it came to canola, seafood, some of our other products. And as far as the vehicles, it was brought back to where we were before these challenging times that we've had with China. But I want to ask Mr. Pike, just in terms of what you think about the approach of the Prime Minister and this government and how we've been able to address these tariffs.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And appreciate you taking meetings with our organization in the past. And it's always good to have representatives outside, the bulk of where canola is grown. I can tell you there is canola in Ontario, and we can show you exactly where. But it's interesting you mentioned the Davos speech. The thing that stuck out the most for us, and I'm going to definitely paraphrase here, a country that can't feed itself, fuel itself, is going to have some challenges, right? So, that's exactly what we do. We do both of those. So, we need to make our Canadian economy strong in that regard. And there's a lot more that we can do. As I mentioned, biofuels is, very indicative of this. And, as we look to international market diversification, I forgot to mention South Korea also as a destination that we're looking at. Those are, immediate things that we have control over. And, to answer your question, we're very pleased, very supportive of Prime Minister Carney's efforts. Early September, he held a canola working group with a number of our representatives, along with his cabinet. And as I mentioned in my preamble, Premier Scott Moe has played a very vital role in this whole process as well. But I would say, we are encouraged, still given the level of uncertainty out there. We're very optimistic and hopeful that product starts to move. Ultimately, that's going to be the measure of success when we start to see product move to China again, but also here at home. I mentioned, some of the challenges that we're, facing with ECCC. That's an area of advancement that, we're going to be looking to government to put a priority on to increase the amount of domestic feedstock, specifically canola, for our biofuel competitive industry.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry you're down to 20 seconds. I'm going to give the last 2 minutes to Mr. Savard-Tremblay, please.
Monsieur Burton.
Mr. Burton, you've already stated in the past that removing tariffs on canola didn't solve anything. Why? And Mr. Pike, you're at the heart of this production. If you could react to what Mr. Burton has said after.
I have enormous sympathy for our canola partners, and I'm quite encouraged by Mr. Pike's suggestion that we need to move more into biofuels. Farmers have enough worry with the rain and the droughts, and now they have to worry about matters that have no relevance whatsoever to hardworking people on tractors or whatever, producing food for Canadians. My heart really goes out to them. China has used this canola thing a lot. Previously they made, I think Mr. Pike would probably agree, completely spurious allegations that the dockage in our canola was full of musks and bugs or something. Wasn't, no basis for this whatsoever. They seem to target canola because it's a powerful constituency, but if China wants to engage in economic leverage, they can then start to go after our other agricultural commodities. They might suggest there's something wrong with our potash or meat or whatever. So it is a dangerous thing. I do think that these agricultural commodities do have a global market. I feel it's regrettable that after the Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels matter was resolved, that we went back to having a very high dependence on the Chinese market for our canola marketing. I really think that we need to be looking to partners that are more likely to maintain contracts in an honest way than having dependence on hoping that we can trust the Chinese to be fair in their dealings with us.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would reiterate the amount of frustration, I guess, that our farmers are facing. We get targeted, I think, because, we're such a large industry, as I mentioned, over $43 billion in economic contribution, representing over 200,000 workers. So we're a major player when it comes to exports to China. And, this isn't the first time that it's happened. And Mr. Burton, I think, characterized it really well. Farmers don't already deal with the weather, a huge level of uncertainty. They don't want to deal with the global geopolitics uncertainty. We want predictability in our international markets. And I keep going back to this, but I'm going to say it again for probably the third or fourth time, but our domestic biofuel policy, that can be increased, so that we don't have to face some of this, geopolitical uncertainty. And over the past few years, we're able to weather, so to speak, some of the storm there with this recent, retaliatory tariffs. But the opportunities out there are, domestically and both internationally, because we can do both well.
Thank you, Mr. Peck. Ms. Wood has raised her hands, and she's been very patient all of this time. I would like to give her the floor for a few minutes or a minute or so.
Sure. Yes, thank you very much, and pleasure to be here. And I'll be quick. Dustin has said many of the points that we want to ensure that you hear, and repeated the topic of biofuels as our market diversification strategy. And I just want to make note that market diversification takes time. It is not something that we are reacting to or putting forward as this is what we want to see right now as a result of some of the tariffs we've just experienced. This is a strategy that our industry has been working on for really years and years. And I would say that's evident by the investments in canola processing that have been on the table and worked on here for perhaps about the last 5 years. And we are starting to see that come into fruition. We anticipate that by the end of 2026, we will have processing capacity in Canada to be able to process about 75% of our canola crop here in Canada. That's incredible. So I just want to reiterate that point, that we are working hard to create new markets, new opportunities for canola farmers. Canola farmers need open, stable access to markets, and that is something that the canola industry has been very much committed and focused on. So while, of course, China is important to us, we anticipate it will be. We see this added opportunity, and there are details that are important to us to get right in order to increase that domestic market share. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much to our witnesses for the wonderful information that you have provided for the committee. To the members, March 10th, we will be doing Mercosur, and March 12th will be the invitation has gone out to the Minister of International Trade regarding the Taiwan motion. Okay. Thank you all very much.